The year is 476 AD. When you hear the term Roman Empire, what's the first image that comes to mind? Disciplined legions marching in perfect formation, all-powerful emperors commanding absolute authority, the Colosseum packed with roaring crowds, and a vast domain stretching from Britannia to the deserts of Egypt. That's the legend we all recognize. Now, set that image aside, because by this moment in history, the Western Roman Empire is no longer a dominant force. It's a fragile remnant, barely holding together, ready to collapse at any second. Today, you're about to uncover how the most powerful empire of the ancient world was erased from the map for good. Before we move forward, here's a quick recommendation. The book Gothic Wars. It has become one of my key references for understanding Rome's decline in the late 4th and 5th centuries. The author breaks down, in a clear and direct way, how scattered groups gradually united into the force that ultimately brought down the Western Roman Empire. If you're interested in going deeper, it's definitely worth checking out. Now, back to the story. To grasp just how dire things had become, consider this. Rome, the so-called eternal city that once ruled the known world, was no longer even the empire's capital. Power had been relocated to Ravenna, a northern city surrounded by marshlands, chosen not for glory, but for survival. Its geography made it far easier to defend against constant invasions. Meanwhile, the empire's territory in the west had shrunk dramatically. Regions that once defined Roman dominance, Gaul, Hispania, and the fertile lands of North Africa, were gone. These territories had fallen into the hands of various Germanic groups, including the Visigoths, Franks, and Vandals. What remained of Roman authority was little more than the Italian peninsula and a scattering of disconnected lands. The sense of collapse had been building for decades. And who was in charge during this critical moment? Officially, it was a boy, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. The irony is impossible to ignore. He carried the names of both Romulus and Augustus, two of the most iconic figures in Roman history. Yet, in reality, he held no real power. He was merely a figurehead in a dangerous political game. The true authority rested with his father, the general Flavius Orestes. In 476 AD, Orestes, serving as Magister Militum, the supreme military commander, seized control through a coup. He removed the legitimate emperor, Julius Nepos, and placed his own son on the throne, ruling from behind the scenes. But this entire system had a fatal flaw. The army that kept Orestes in power was barely Roman anymore. The legendary legions, once made up of loyal citizens carrying red shields and unwavering devotion, had all but disappeared. In their place stood foreign mercenaries, warriors drawn from tribes such as the Heruli, Rugi, and Siri. Rome had effectively outsourced its own defense. These men didn't fight for honor, tradition, or loyalty to an emperor. They fought for gold, supplies, and survival. And there was one more problem. The gold was running out. The imperial treasury was nearly empty, and the economy was in ruins. The situation was no longer unstable, it was explosive. Orestes was sitting on top of a powder keg, and the mercenaries, they were already holding the match. This is the moment when the powder keg finally ignites. The timeline now moves to August 476 AD. Picture the atmosphere inside the military camps, thick with tension, uncertainty, and quiet anger. The Germanic soldiers who had become Rome's last line of defense began asking a dangerous question. If we are the ones fighting and protecting this land, why don't we own any part of it? Up until then, these mercenaries had been compensated in gold or through a system known as hospitalitas, which provided them with lodging and supplies. But by this stage, the imperial treasury was drained, payments were unreliable, and promises had lost all value. So the soldiers took a bold and unprecedented step. They approached the general Flavius Orestes with a demand that would permanently change the balance of power. They no longer wanted wages, they wanted land. More specifically, they demanded 1/3 of all land across the Italian peninsula, territory where they could settle their families, build homes, and establish a permanent future. This was not just a request, it was a direct challenge to Roman authority. For Orestes, this was completely unacceptable. He had already made significant concessions just to keep his son, Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. But handing over a third of Italy, the very heart of what remained of Roman identity, was a line he refused to cross. Without hesitation, he rejected the demand. That decision would prove fatal. The Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, writing years later, described the growing arrogance among these so-called barbarian troops. According to his account, Orestes' refusal acted as the spark that triggered open rebellion. The situation, already unstable, now tipped into full-blown crisis. Because here's the reality. When you deny an armed force that is already inside your borders, inside your cities, you must have a plan to control the fallout. Orestes had no such plan. And that is where a new figure steps into the spotlight: Odoacer. Odoacer was a Germanic officer, likely of the Syri, who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military itself. He understood both sides, the Roman system and the frustrations of the mercenaries. More importantly, he recognized opportunity when it appeared. Turning to the discontented troops, Odoacer made a simple but powerful promise. "Follow me, and I will give you the land that Orestes refused." That was all it took. On August 23, 476 AD, inside a military camp, the rebellious soldiers lifted Odoacer onto their shields, a long-standing Germanic tradition used to proclaim a new leader. In that moment, he was declared king. What had started as a dispute over unpaid wages instantly transformed into something far greater, a full-scale uprising. Within days, the rebellion evolved into a determined campaign to seize control of Italy itself. And at the top of Odoacer's list stood one man, Flavius Orestes. Now marked as the primary target, Orestes had no choice but to run. The man who once held power behind the throne was suddenly fighting for his own survival. With Odoacer crowned by the troops and the date of August 23rd marking the turning point, the clock began ticking, relentlessly, against Orestes. Not long ago, this was the man quietly directing the fate of the Western world from behind the curtain. Now, Flavius Orestes had become a moving target, hunted within the very land he once controlled. Picture the urgency, the panic. Orestes gathered what remained of his loyal troops and began a rapid retreat. Time was no longer a luxury, it was his only hope. If he could regroup, rebuild, and contain the uprising quickly, there was still a chance to stop the collapse before it consumed all of Italy. His first refuge was the fortified city of Pavia, known at the time as Ticinium. Strong walls, strategic position, it seemed like a defensible stand. But Odoacer had no intention of slowing down or allowing his former commander a moment to recover. The rebel army advanced with speed and precision. When they reached Pavia, the assault was overwhelming. The city was stormed and brutally sacked. Chaos spread through the streets, and according to historical accounts, the local bishop Epiphanius of Pavia threw himself into the turmoil, desperately trying to negotiate mercy for the civilians caught in the violence. But Orestes already knew those walls would not hold for long. Once again, he fled, this time heading toward Piacenza, hoping to stay one step ahead. What followed was no longer a retreat, it was a desperate chase, a race against an unstoppable force. And it was in Piacenza that the pursuit reached its brutal conclusion. Events unfolded at a speed that was extraordinary even by the standards of the ancient world. Just 5 days after the rebellion first erupted, on August 28, 476 AD, the forward units of Odoacer's army caught up with Orestes. There were no drawn-out sieges, no carefully constructed battle lines, no elaborate tactics. This was a sudden, decisive clash. Odoacer's forces, hardened veterans shaped by years of relentless warfare, crashed into Orestes' exhausted troops with devastating efficiency. The outcome was never truly in doubt. This was the end of the line. Orestes was captured on the battlefield and executed immediately. There was no Roman trial, no appeal to the Senate, no final plea. The man who had seized power just a year earlier now paid for that gamble with his life, undone by the very soldiers he had tried to control. With his death in Piacenza, the last meaningful shield protecting what remained of the Western Roman Empire collapsed completely. Now, Odoacer faced no major army capable of stopping him. The military path ahead was wide open, leading straight to the center of power. As August came to a close and Orestes lay dead, panic spread like wildfire. Messengers rode hard across the countryside carrying the news, north, and soon enough, that message reached the gates of Ravenna. Before we move forward, it's worth pausing for a moment to understand the setting. Ravenna was not just another city, it was a natural fortress. Surrounded by vast marshlands, thick mud, and connected to the sea, it was incredibly difficult for any invading force to approach. This is precisely why the imperial government had relocated there years earlier. If there was one place where the empire could realistically survive a prolonged siege, this was it. Inside those defenses stood the young emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He was protected by what remained of a loyal garrison, now commanded by Paulus, the brother of Flavius Orestes and the boy's uncle. In every sense, Paulus represented the final line of defense for the Western Roman Empire. But the reality inside Ravenna was grim. The morale of those soldiers had already collapsed. News of Orestes' defeat had spread quickly, and they knew the truth. The main army was gone. In its place, a victorious and battle-hardened force of mercenaries was advancing straight toward them. And Odoacer did not hesitate. In the early days of September 476 AD, his forces arrived on the outskirts of Ravenna. Under normal circumstances, the city's geography would have forced any attacker into a slow, exhausting siege. But this time, that expectation never became reality. The imperial military structure was simply too broken to hold. Resistance collapsed almost immediately. The final confrontation took place just outside the city, near the old port of Classe, on September 4th, 476 AD. It was there, among the pine groves, that Paulus was killed. With his death, the last organized defense crumbled completely. The massive walls of the capital, once symbols of strength and security, now stood nearly empty, with too few soldiers left to defend them. Ravenna fell. Odoacer's troops marched into the city facing little to no resistance. At that moment, the heart of the Western Roman Empire simply stopped beating. Inside the palace, the young emperor was now completely trapped. Romulus Augustulus, no more than 15 or 16 years old, could likely hear the heavy footsteps of Germanic warriors echoing through the corridors. There was nowhere left to run, no army left to call upon. All that remained was to wait for whatever fate was about to arrive. And given the brutal traditions of the ancient world, the expectation was clear. Rival rulers were usually eliminated to prevent future uprisings. But at this exact moment, when everything pointed toward a violent end, history takes an unexpected turn. And now comes one of the most unexpected moments in this entire story. When Odoacer finally stood face to face with the frightened young emperor Romulus Augustulus, he made a decision that was highly unusual for that era. He chose mercy. According to the historian Jordanus, Odoacer was moved by the boy's age. Instead of ordering his execution, as tradition would have demanded, he spared his life. But mercy did not mean power. Romulus was forced to abdicate the throne, stripped of all authority, and quietly removed from the political stage. Rather than facing a violent end, he was sent into comfortable exile. He was relocated to a fortified villa in the region of Campania, near Naples, and granted a generous annual pension of 6,000 gold solidi. In a single moment, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire vanished, not through bloodshed, but through silence. What Odoacer did next, however, was a masterstroke of political strategy. He understood something crucial. The title of Western Roman Emperor had become more of a liability than a position of power. It no longer commanded real authority. It only painted a target on the back of whoever held it. So instead of claiming the imperial crown for himself, Odoacer made a move that carried enormous symbolic weight. He gathered the imperial regalia, the jeweled diadem, the purple robe, and the scepter, and sent them east to Constantinople. Alongside these powerful symbols, a delegation of Roman senators was dispatched with a clear and calculated message for the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The Byzantine historian Malchus of Philadelphia recorded the essence of that message. The senators declared that there was no longer any need for a separate Western Empire. One emperor, they argued, was enough to rule both East and West. At the same time, they requested that Odoacer be officially recognized as patrician, a representative governing Italy on behalf of Constantinople. And just like that, without a final, dramatic battle, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. No grand last stand, no single decisive clash, just a quiet, irreversible shift. Odoacer assumed the title of King of Italy, effectively closing the chapter on the ancient world and opening the door to what we now call the Middle Ages. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And right here, you'll find another video suggestion to continue exploring history.